Hey guys, and tonight we are traveling back in time, not just by years, but by mindset. You're standing on the sun-bleached docks of a city that doesn't just exist on the map, but in the very soul of history. Alexandria, Egypt, around 280 BC. The air is thick with the scent of sea salt, exotic spices from the east, and the faint, dusty smell of papyrus from 1,000 different shores. You can hear a symphony of languages, Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Hebrew, all mingling under the watchful gaze of the newly constructed Pharaoh's lighthouse, its brilliant beacon just beginning to cut through the twilight haze. This isn't just a place. It's an idea made real, a global crossroads of commerce and intellect. And frankly, given the state of ancient medicine, sanitation, and the occasional political purge, you probably wouldn't survive this for more than a week. So before you get properly comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually like what we do here. We also love to see how far these stories travel, so feel free to drop your city and local time in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for some gentle background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take a tentative step off the gangplank, your modern sensibilities immediately assaulted by the sheer, unfiltered reality of the ancient world. The ground beneath your sandals is a packed earth mixture of dust, spilled grain, and things you'd rather not identify. The harbor is a forest of masts from ships that have sailed from every known corner of the world. Muscular dockworkers, their skin glistening with sweat under the relentless Egyptian sun, haul amphorae of wine and olive oil, their shouts echoing in a rhythmic cacophony. You dodge a cart pulled by a pair of stubborn donkeys, their owner cursing them in a dialect of Greek you barely recognize. The city rises before you, a masterpiece of Hellenistic planning imposed upon an ancient land. Wide, grid-like avenues, a stark contrast to the tangled warrens of older cities, stretch towards the horizon. White marble and limestone buildings gleam, their facades adorned with Greek columns and Egyptian motifs, fusion of cultures that feels both brilliant and slightly jarring. This is the vision of Alexander the Great, the man who dreamed of a world where cultures could blend, and though he died before he could see it flourish, his legacy breathes in the very stones of this place. His body even rests here, in a magnificent tomb somewhere in the heart of the city, a silent, powerful anchor to his grand experiment. You're here for a specific reason, though. Not to trade spices or study the stars, but to witness the birth of an institution that will become a legend, a place of knowledge so vast it will be whispered about for millennia after it is gone. You are here to see the Library of Alexandria. But it isn't just a building you can walk up to. It's part of a larger, even more ambitious project. You ask a nearby merchant, a man with a neatly trimmed beard and kind eyes, for directions to the Museum. He smiles, recognizing the term. The Museum, or Shrine of the Muses, is the talk of the town, the pet project of the new king, Ptolemy I Soter. He was one of Alexander's most trusted generals, a canny, battle-hardened Macedonian who, in the chaotic aftermath of Alexander's death, carved out the richest piece of the empire for himself, Egypt. Historians still debate whether Ptolemy was a genuine intellectual with a passion for knowledge, or simply a shrewd politician who understood that intellectual capital was just as valuable as gold. Perhaps he was both. He saw that to legitimize his Greek dynasty in the ancient land of the pharaohs, he needed more than just military might. He needed to make Alexandria the undeniable center of the Hellenistic world, outshining even Athens. As you navigate the bustling streets, you can't help but notice the strange little details of daily life. A woman passes by, her makeup striking heavy black coal lining her eyes, a common practice for both aesthetic reasons and for its supposed ability to ward off eye infections and the evil eye. It's a practical sort of magic. Less practical, you think, is the popular form of sunscreen you've heard about, a paste made from rice bran and, for the truly well-to-do, Crocodile Dome. You make a mental note to stick to the shaded colonnades. The city is a sensory overload. The smell of baking bread from a communal oven mingles with the floral scent of lotus blossoms from a nearby temple garden. You hear the rhythmic clanging of a blacksmith's hammer and the distant, hypnotic chanting of priests from a temple dedicated to Serapis, a new god created specifically to bridge the gap between Greek and Egyptian beliefs. It is all part of the Ptolemaic brand. Take the best of both worlds and create something new. It's an audacious, arrogant, and utterly brilliant strategy. You turn onto the Canopic Way, the city's main artery, a grand boulevard said to be over 30 meters wide. It runs through the Brachyon, the royal quarter, where the Ptolemies live and govern. And it's here, nestled among palaces and temples, that you will find the home of the Muses, the place where the world's knowledge is being gathered, one scroll at a time. The sun is setting, casting long shadows, and the air begins to cool. Your journey is just beginning. You find yourself standing before an impressive, yet surprisingly understated, entrance. There's no giant sign that says, Musam this way. It's simply a part of the sprawling royal palace complex, an area generally off-limits to the common citizen. But you're not a common citizen tonight. You are an observer, a ghost from the future, and you slip through the gates with the quiet confidence of someone who doesn't belong. The frantic energy of the port city melts away, replaced by a profound and scholarly peace. You are now inside the domain of Ptolemy I Soter's grand vision. And what a vision it is! The story goes that the idea for the Musam and its library wasn't Ptolemy's own, but was suggested to him by an interesting character named Demetrius of Phalerum. Demetrius was an Athenian statesman and orator, a student of Aristotle's school, who found himself on the losing side of a political squabble back in Athens and had to flee for his life. He found refuge here in Alexandria, bringing with him the Athenian blueprint for a center of learning. He supposedly told Ptolemy, "Hey, king, you know what would really put you on the map? A library that contains a copy of every book in the world." It was the kind of fantastically ambitious idea that a man like Ptolemy, a man who had marched to the edges of the known world with Alexander, could appreciate. It was a new kind of conquest, not of land, but of the human mind. You walk through manicured gardens, the pathways lined with statues of Greek philosophers and Egyptian pharaohs, a visual reminder of the cultural fusion at play. Fountains gurgle softly, their waters feeding into channels that irrigate beds of fragrant herbs and flowers used for both study and simple pleasure. Scholars stroll in pairs and small groups, deep in conversation, their robes rustling in the gentle evening breeze. They don't walk with the hurried purpose of merchants, but with the meandering pace of men whose work is pure thought. This, you realize, is the Musam itself. It's not a museum in our modern sense of a place with dusty exhibits behind glass. It's a research institute, the world's first government-funded think tank. The complex includes lecture halls, laboratories for dissection, a practice still largely taboo in mainland Greece, an astronomical observatory, and even a dining commons where all the resident scholars eat together. It was, for all intents and purposes, a paradise for the intellectually curious. The scholars who were invited here by Ptolemy I, and later his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus, were given a ridiculously good deal: a generous stipend, free room and board, and a complete exemption from all taxes. Their only job was to think, to research, to write, and to argue. It was the ultimate academic fellowship, and it attracted the greatest minds from all over the Hellenistic world. You can feel the intellectual energy thrumming in the air. It's the engine of this city's prestige. Ptolemy understood a fundamental truth: knowledge is power. By gathering the world's greatest thinkers, he wasn't just hoarding intellects. He was hoarding innovations. The discoveries made here in engineering, medicine, and mathematics would have direct military and economic applications. A better understanding of astronomy meant better navigation for his merchant fleet and navy. A new type of catapult designed by a resident engineer could give his army an edge in the next war. It was a long-term investment in supremacy. One of the stranger, less discussed aspects of this intellectual paradise was the House of the Muses itself. While it fostered incredible collaboration, some ancient commentators, like Timon of Phlius, were a bit more cynical. He famously quipped that the scholars were like fatted fowls in a coop, well fed and cared for, but ultimately caged and squabbling endlessly over minute points of grammar while the king pulled the strings. It's a bit of a harsh take, but it contains a kernel of truth. The scholars were, in a sense, living in a gilded cage. Their freedom was immense, but it was contingent on the king's favor. Step out of line, and your funding and your place in paradise could be revoked. As you continue your walk, you pass a large, elegant hall from which you hear the low murmur of voices. Peeking inside, you see scholars reclining on couches around a low table, sharing a meal and engaged in what looks like a fierce but friendly debate. This is the communal dining hall, a key feature borrowed from Aristotle's Lyceum. The idea was that intellectual breakthroughs don't just happen in a study. They happen over wine, during a shared meal, in the spark of conversation. Historians still debate the precise relationship between the Musam and the library. Was the library simply one part of the Musam, or were they two separate but connected institutions? As surviving texts are ambiguous. The most common view is that the library was the centerpiece, the heart of the Musam. But the entire complex, the gardens, the labs, the lecture halls, functioned as one cohesive whole. You're getting closer now to that heart. The air seems to grow quieter, more reverent. You see a separate, even more magnificent structure connected to the main complex by a marble colonnade. There are no sounds of debate coming from this building, only a profound, anticipatory silence. This is it, the great library, the Bibliotheca, the reason you're here. You follow the covered walkway, the marble cool beneath your feet. The columns on either side of you are enormous, fluted in the Corinthian style, their capitals blooming with carved acanthus leaves. The scale is designed to make you feel small, to impress upon you the gravity of the place you are about to enter. This isn't just a building. It's a temple, and the gods worshipped here are knowledge and reason. You reach the end of the colonnade and stand before a set of massive cedarwood doors, intricately carved with scenes of the Muses, the 9 goddesses of art, literature, and science. A quiet attendant, dressed in a simple linen robe, gives you a respectful nod, as if you were a visiting scholar from Rhodes or Pergamum, and pulls one of the heavy doors open for you. The first thing that hits you is the smell. It's a scent that book lovers from any era would recognize, yet it's different, more organic. It's the dry, slightly sweet, earthy aroma of papyrus, tens of thousands of rolls of it, mingling with the sharp mineral tongue of ink and the faint, pleasant scent of cedar oil, which was used as a natural insect, repellent to protect the precious scrolls. It's the perfume of preserved thought. You step inside, and your eyes need a moment to adjust to the relatively dim light. The main hall is vast, a cavern of knowledge. Sunlight filters down from high, narrow windows near the ceiling, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden sprites. The room is lined with walls of polished wood, and built into these walls are hundreds, perhaps thousands, of small, square niches or pigeonholes, stretching from the floor to a ceiling so high it's lost in shadow. Each niche is packed with pale, rolled-up scrolls. This is the library's famous shelving system. Each scroll has a small, dangling tag made of parchment or bone, a syllabus that identifies its contents, much like the spine of a modern book. It's a simple but effective system for a library of this scale. You see scribes sitting at long tables in the center of the hall, their heads bent in concentration, painstakingly copying texts. The only sounds are the gentle scratching of their reed pens, the soft rustle of papyrus, and the quiet footsteps of scholars moving between the shelves. The atmosphere is one of hushed reverence, like a cathedral dedicated to the written word. This place is known as the Bibliotheca, the Great Library, and it's the larger of the two libraries in Alexandria. Its primary function was to serve the scholars of the Museum. This was not a public library in the sense we understand today. You couldn't just walk in off the street, get a library card, and check out the latest philosophical treatise. Access was a privilege, reserved for the resident academics, visiting dignitaries, and perhaps the royal family. A common historical fact is that this main library was part of the royal quarter, emphasizing its exclusivity. You wander deeper, gazing at the rows upon rows of scrolls. You can only imagine the treasures stored here. Complete collections of the great Greek playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, the philosophical works of Plato and Aristotle, histories by Herodotus and Thucydides, epic poems, medical texts, mathematical treatises, astronomical charts. And that's just the Greek literature. The Ptolemies were voracious collectors, and they sought texts from all over the known world, translating them into Greek. The Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek here, a project known as the Septuagint, commissioned, according to legend, by Ptolemy II Philadelphus himself. One of the more peculiar details about the library's operation was its scriptorium, the copying center you see before you. The quality of a copy was paramount. Scribes were highly trained professionals, and their work was checked and double-checked for errors. However, an odd problem arose. What constituted the master copy? Sometimes a new scroll would arrive, say, of Homer's Iliad, that contained different lines or spellings than the version they already had. The scholars of the library, particularly figures like Zenodotus of Ephesus, the first head librarian, became the world's first textual critics. They would compare different versions, debate which one was the most authentic, and create a new, edited master text. This process sometimes involved making educated guesses or even correcting what they saw as flaws in the original. So in a way, they weren't just preserving knowledge. They were actively shaping it, creating the definitive editions that would be copied and passed down for centuries. It was a role that gave them immense, almost godlike power over the literary canon. As you gaze at the dizzying array of scrolls, you realize the logistical nightmare of trying to find anything in this collection. With potentially hundreds of thousands of scrolls, how did anyone locate a specific work? This brings us to one of the unsung heroes of the library, Callimachus of Cyrene. He was a poet and scholar who worked here during the 3rd century BCE. He undertook a monumental task to create a catalog of the library's entire holdings. The result was the Pinax, or tablets, a multi-volume work that was essentially the world's first library card catalog. The Pinax listed works by author and genre, provided a short biography of the author, and even included the first few words of the text to help with identification. It was a revolutionary achievement in information science. Historians still debate the exact size of the collection. The numbers thrown around by ancient writers are staggering 400,000 scrolls, 500,000. You move away from the main hall, deeper into the library's complex. The sheer ambition of the place is intoxicating. It's one thing to build a library, but it's another thing entirely to aim to collect every single piece of writing in existence. This brings you to the somewhat aggressive, and frankly, quite modern-sounding, acquisition policy of the Ptolemies. They were the original book hunters, and their methods ranged from the conventional to the downright piratical. Ptolemy II and his son, Ptolemy III Euergetes, were particularly relentless. They sent agents across the Mediterranean and into Asia Minor with massive budgets, tasked with buying or copying any important text they could find. They hunted for books in the markets of Rhodes, Athens, and Antioch with the same fervor that their predecessors had hunted for new territories. It was a global dragnet for the written word. You can almost picture these ancient acquisitions librarians, A mix of scholar and spy, haggling in dusty back-alley bookshops, their saddlebags clinking with royal silver. You find yourself in a smaller room, perhaps an office for one of the head librarians. On a desk, you see a scroll left open. Its text a detailed inventory of recent arrivals. This is where the real nitty-gritty of the library's growth happened. The most famous and audacious of their collection policies was a royal decree issued by Ptolemy III. The law stated that any and every book found aboard a ship docking in Alexandria as harbor had to be surrendered to the state. The ships and their passengers would wait while the books were taken to the library, where the professional scribes of the scriptorium would make high-quality copies. The brand-new copy would then be returned to the owner, while the original, the older, more authoritative version, was kept by the library and added to its collection. These confiscated books were famously labeled "from the ships." It was an act of stunning intellectual piracy, sanctioned at the highest level. You can imagine the frustration of a sea captain or a traveling scholar, forced to hand over his personal library only to get a photocopy back. There was no thank you option. It was the law. One of the most legendary stories of this policy involves the official state copies of the plays of the great Athenian tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These were master copies, held in the Athenian archives, and the city was extremely reluctant to let them go. Ptolemy III, however, was determined to have them. He borrowed the scrolls from Athens, promising to have them copied and returned promptly. As collateral, he deposited a truly enormous sum of silver with the Athenian government, 15 talents, an amount that could have funded a small war. The Athenians, reassured by this kingly deposit, handed over their priceless literary heritage. Time passed, and the scrolls did not return. Instead, a message arrived from Alexandria, along with a set of beautifully prepared new copies. Ptolemy III informed the Athenians that he would be keeping the originals, and they could keep the 15 talents of silver as compensation. He essentially paid a massive fine for the greatest act of book theft in history. It's a move that feels both gangster and deeply nerdy at the same time. The Athenians were furious, but what could they do? Argue with the richest and most powerful king in the Mediterranean? They took the silver. This relentless drive to acquire everything had a fascinating side effect. It created a boom in the book forgery market. Realizing the Ptolemies would pay top drachma for any ancient or rare text, unscrupulous dealers began to manufacture fakes. They would artificially age papyrus, invent plausible-sounding authors, and write texts in an archaic style. The Roman physician Galen, writing centuries later, mentioned this phenomenon, noting that forgers would create fake works by famous physicians or philosophers to sell to the ever-eager buyers from Alexandria. This meant the scholars at the library had to become not just editors and librarians, but also authenticators and literary detectives, trying to weed out the forgeries from the genuine articles. Historians still debate how successful they were. It is entirely possible that the hallowed shelves of the great library held not only timeless masterpieces, but also a fair amount of cleverly disguised ancient fan fiction. It's a strangely comforting thought that even in this temple of high intellect, people were still trying to pull a fast one. The sheer volume of incoming material must have been overwhelming. Imagine the scene: daily arrivals of scrolls from the ships, new acquisitions from royal agents, and gifts from patrons all flooding into the library. Each one had to be unpacked, cleaned, identified, and cataloged. If it was a new work, it went to the scribes for a master copy to be made. If it was a different version of a work they already had, it went to the scholars for textual comparison. It was a factory of knowledge, a relentless churning process of acquisition and curation. You look back at the inventory scroll on the desk. It's a simple list of titles and origins, but it represents a fundamental shift in human history. For the first time, a single institution was attempting to create a universal archive of human thought. The goal was audacious, the methods were questionable, But the result was a concentration of intellectual firepower the world had never seen before, and might never see again. Leaving the administrative chambers behind, you decide to follow one of the scholars you saw earlier. You want to understand what a day in the life of one of these fatted fowls, as the cynic Timon called them, was actually like. You trail a man with a thoughtful expression and a slight stoop, as if from years spent poring over texts. He enters a quiet, cloistered garden, sits on a stone bench beside a small, bubbling fountain, and unrolls a scroll, his lips moving silently as he reads. The life of a scholar at the Musone was on the surface idyllic. As you know, they received a government salary, free food and lodging, and were exempt from the taxes that burdened ordinary citizens. This was a life dedicated purely to the mind, free from the mundane worries of making a living. They were, in essence, the first professional academics. The king's patronage gave them the freedom to pursue their research without distraction. They could spend a decade working on a detailed commentary of Homer, or dedicate their entire lives to mapping the stars. The man on the bench might be someone like Zenodotus of Ephesus, the first superintendent of the library, a grammarian who took on the colossal task of organizing the epic poems of Homer and Hesiod into a standardized form. Or perhaps he's a younger, more ambitious scholar, hoping to make a name for himself and secure a permanent position. The competition was fierce. While the lifestyle was comfortable, it was also a high-pressure environment. Your worth was measured in your intellectual output, the poems you wrote, the treatises you published, the students you taught. A common fact about the Musone is that it housed not just literary scholars, but some of the greatest scientific and mathematical minds of the age. This is where Euclid, the father of geometry, likely wrote or compiled his Elements, the textbook that would define the teaching of mathematics for over 2,000 years. You can imagine him, a precise and logical man, demonstrating theorems in a sandpit in one of the courtyards. His students gathered around, mesmerized by the elegant certainty of his proofs. You continue your spectral wandering and peer into another room. Here, the scene is very different. It's an anatomy theater. On a stone slab lies a human body, and a scholar, perhaps the famous physician Horrifying, is performing a dissection. A small group of students watches with intense focus. This was one of the most radical and controversial activities at the Musone. In mainland Greece, the dissection of human cadavers was a powerful taboo. The body was considered sacred and was not to be mutilated after death. But the Ptolemies, blending Greek scientific curiosity with older Egyptian traditions of mummification and embalming, allowed it. For the first time in history, physicians could study human anatomy directly. Horrifying was a pioneer, the first to distinguish between motor and sensory nerves, to identify the brain as the seat of intelligence, not the heart, as Aristotle had believed, and to conduct detailed studies of the eye, liver, and reproductive organs. His contemporary, Erasistratus, studied the circulatory system and came remarkably close to understanding the circulation of blood, a discovery that wouldn't be fully realized until Harvey 1,800 years later. This was groundbreaking, world-changing science, and it was happening right here, thanks to the unique cultural and political environment of Ptolemaic Alexandria. Of course, with such controversial work came dark rumors. Rival physicians and conservative thinkers were horrified by the practice of dissection. A strange and ghoulish accusation, which remains a fringe but fascinating tidbit of history, was leveled against Horrifying and Erasistratus by later writers like the Roman encyclopedist Celsus. He claimed they didn't just dissect the dead, but practiced vivisection dissecting living, condemned criminals supplied to them from the king's prisons. He wrote that they could observe the parts while they were still breathing. Historians still debate this shocking claim. Is it a grotesque slander, a piece of ancient propaganda designed to discredit the Alexandrian school of medicine? Or does it contain a horrifying grain of truth? Most scholars today are skeptical, believing it to be an exaggeration. But the fact that the rumor existed at all speaks to the revolutionary and to some terrifying nature of the work being done here. It was a place that pushed the boundaries of knowledge and also the boundaries of ethics. You can imagine the debates that must have raged in the communal dining hall. A poet arguing with a mathematician about the nature of beauty. A physician debating an astronomer about the makeup of the human soul. A historian questioning a philosopher about the meaning of truth. This was the true function of the Musang, to create a crucible of intellect where different disciplines could collide and spark new ideas. One of the most famous polymaths to embody this spirit was Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who would eventually become the head librarian. He was a mathematician, a geographer, a poet, an astronomer, and a music theorist. He was the ultimate Renaissance man, 1,700 years before the Renaissance. He invented the discipline of geography, and he was the man who, while working here, performed one of the most elegant and famous experiments in history. He calculated the circumference of the Earth with astounding accuracy, using little more than a well, a stick, and some brilliant geometry. That discovery, that life's work, was born from the unique ecosystem of this place, a place where you could study geometry with Euclid's successors in the morning, consult ancient geographic texts in the afternoon, and debate it all with your peers over dinner. It was, for a brief, shining moment, the intellectual center of the universe. Your exploration of the Musang complex has shown you the primary hub of knowledge, but the collection of scrolls was growing at an uncontrollable rate. Even the vast halls of the great library were beginning to feel cramped. The solution was quintessentially pragmatic and grand. They built an annex. You leave the opulent royal quarter of the Bruchion and make your way through the city to a different district, the Rakotis. This was the older Egyptian quarter of the city, a place with narrower streets and a more distinctly native character. And here, standing on a man-made acropolis, a high hill that dominated the neighborhood, was a magnificent temple complex dedicated to the god Serapis. This is your destination, the Serapeum, home of the daughter library. The temple itself is an architectural marvel. It's a masterful blend of Egyptian and Greek styles, designed to appeal to both major populations of the city. Serapis was a syncretic deity, a composite of the Egyptian god of the underworld, Osiris, and the sacred bull, Apis, but depicted with the beard and flowing hair of a Greek god like Zeus or Hades. He was a Ptolemaic invention, a god for their new, blended world. Walking up the grand staircase to the temple said to have 100 steps. You feel you're approaching something of immense civic importance. Unlike the exclusive Musang, the Serapeum was a public space, a center of community life and worship. And nestled within its sacred grounds was the daughter library. This library served a different function from its parent institution. It was more accessible to the general public, or at least to the literate citizens of Alexandria who weren't part of the elite scholarly circle of the Musang. It housed what might be considered overflow material from the great library, duplicate, copies, less critical editions of famous works, and perhaps more popular or instructional texts. A common fact is that the daughter library was a significant collection in its own right. Some estimates place its holdings at around 42,800 scrolls. To put that in perspective, that alone was larger than almost any other library in the world at the time. It was the little sister to the great library, but it was still a giant. You enter the library, which is arranged around a vast, open-air courtyard, surrounded by covered porticos. The setup feels more open and less imposing than the great library. You see more people here, students, local scribes, perhaps even a few wealthy merchants with an intellectual bent browsing the shelves or reading at tables set up in the shaded walkways. The atmosphere is still studious, but less intensely rarefied than at the Musang. This was knowledge for the city, not just for the scholars in their gilded cage. You can imagine a young student of medicine coming here to consult a simplified anatomical text, or a budding poet reading the classics to hone his craft. It played a vital role in the wider intellectual life of Alexandria, disseminating the knowledge that was being curated and refined in the main library. The scrolls here were likely organized in a similar fashion, with the familiar pigeonhole shells and identifying silly boy tags. It was a branch campus, an extension of the Ptolemaic mission to educate and awe, a peculiar and rather charming legend associated with the Serapeum involves the colossal cult statue of the god Serapis that stood in the main temple sanctuary. The statue was said to be a breathtaking work of art, made of precious metals and dark wood adorned with jewels. An obscure tidbit reported by several ancient writers, including the historian Rufinus, claims the statue was cleverly engineered. It was said that a hidden window was positioned in the temple wall in such a way that, on a specific day and time, a single ray of sunlight would pass through it and illuminate the lips of the statue, making it appear as if the god himself was greeting the sun god, Ra. Some even claimed that a priest could use a magnet to move iron filings placed on the statue's head, creating the illusion that the idol was moving or nodding. Historians still debate the veracity of these claims. Are they Christian propaganda meant to portray pagan priests as tricksters? Or do they reflect genuine Hellenistic ingenuity in using science to create a sense of divine mystery? Whatever. The truth, it paints a picture of this Serapeum as a place where faith, art, and clever engineering coexisted. It was a place of wonders, both intellectual and theological. The existence of a second, large library often confuses the narrative of the Library of Alexandria's destruction. For centuries, people have conflated the two, imagining a single, catastrophic event that wiped out one massive library. But the reality was more complex. There were two major collections in two different parts of the city, under different administrative controls, one royal and scholarly, the other religious and public. Understanding this distinction is crucial to untangling the long and messy story of the library's eventual demise. The fate of the daughter library in the Serapeum would be very different from the fate of the great library in the Bruchion. For now, however, in the golden age of the Ptolemies, both are thriving. You see a scribe carefully re-rolling a scroll of Euripides' plays. He handles it with a practiced gentleness, a reverence for the object itself and the world it contains. Here, in the shadow of a man-made god, the words of poets and philosophers were given a second home, a place where they could reach a wider audience and seed the minds of a new generation. The whole city, it seems, was a library. You return to the hallowed halls of the Musang, drawn back to the epicenter of innovation. It's one thing to collect and catalog the knowledge of the past, but the true genius of the library and its parent institution was its ability to generate new knowledge. This was a place of discovery, not just preservation. You find your way to a courtyard where a man is conducting a seemingly simple experiment. He has a tall stick, a gnomon, planted vertically in the ground, and he is carefully measuring the length of the shadow it casts. This is Eratosthenes of Cyrene, the head librarian you encountered earlier, and you are witnessing a pivotal moment in the history of science. A common and celebrated fact is that Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. His method was pure genius in its simplicity. He had read in a book in the library that on the summer solstice at noon, in the southern city of Syene, modern Aswan, the sun was directly overhead, casting no shadows. Obelisks cast no shadow, and the sun's rays illuminated the bottom of a deep well. Eratosthenes, here in Alexandria, observed that at the very same time on the same day, the gnomon in his courtyard did cast a shadow. He measured the angle of that shadow and found it to be about 7.2 degrees, or 1/50th of a full circle. He reasoned that if the Earth was a sphere, then this difference in shadow angle must be due to the curvature of the planet's surface. Angle of the shadow in Alexandria, relative to the full 360 degrees of a circle, must be proportional to the distance between Alexandria and Syene, relative to the full circumference of the Earth. The only missing piece of information was the distance between the two cities. He hired bemetists, professional surveyors trained to measure distances by counting their steps, to pace out the journey. They came back with a figure of about 5,000 stadia. With this data, he performed a simple calculation. If 5,000 stadia is 1/50th of the whole, then the whole must be 50 times 5,000, which equals 250,000 stadia. Depending on which stadian length he was using, the exact measure is debated. His estimate was, at worst, about 15% off the true value, and at best, as close as 1 to 2%. It was an astonishing intellectual leap, made possible by a library book, a stick, and a brilliant mind nurtured by the MUSAEUM, that you wander into a different part of the complex, a workshop filled with gears, levers, and strange metal contraptions. The air smells of hot metal and oil. Here another genius is at work, hero of Alexandria. Though he lived a bit later, during the Roman period, his work is a direct continuation of the Hellenistic tradition of mechanical engineering fostered. Here, you see on a workbench a curious device, a hollow sphere mounted on a pair of pipes that lead down into a sealed cauldron of water. A fire is lit beneath the cauldron. As the water boils, steam travels up the pipes and into the sphere, escaping through two L-shaped nozzles on opposite sides. The escaping steam creates thrust, causing the sphere to spin rapidly on its axis. This is the Eolipile, essentially the world's first, albeit very simple, steam engine. To Hero, it was mostly a novelty, a temple wonder to demonstrate the power of air and steam. He never thought to hook it up to a cart or a pump. It was a brilliant invention without a practical application, a toy for thinkers. Still, the principles of rocketry and steam power are right there, spinning on a workbench, 17 centuries before the Industrial Revolution. The mechanical wonders didn't stop there. Hero was a prolific inventor and writer. He described automated temple doors that would open as if by magic when a fire was lit on the altar, powered by the expansion of hot air. He designed a wind-powered organ, the first known instance of wind being used to power a machine. He invented a vending machine that would dispense a measure of holy water when a coin was inserted. You can almost picture it standing outside the Serapeum, a much more efficient way to handle offerings than a human priest. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? Maybe this is a better look for ancient innovation. An odd and slightly less glamorous invention attributed to Hero was a powerful syringe-like pump used for dousing fires, which also found a less noble use as a water cannon for practical jokes. It's a delightful image, the greatest mechanical engineer of his age, giggling as he soaks a stuffy grammarian from across the courtyard. The level of scientific and technological advancement here was simply staggering, and it raises one of the great what-if questions of history. They had steam power, advanced mechanics, and a deep understanding of geometry and physics. Why didn't the Industrial Revolution happen in Roman Alexandria? Historians still debate this fascinating question. Some argue it was a matter of economics. The widespread availability of slave labor meant there was no real economic incentive to develop labor-saving machines. Why build a steam-powered crane when you have hundreds of slaves to do the work for you? Others point to a cultural mindset. The Greek intellectual tradition often separated theoretical knowledge, episteme, from practical application, techne, viewing the latter as less noble. The Eolipile was a fascinating demonstration of a principle. not a solution to a problem. Whatever the reason, the seeds of a modern technological world were sown here, but they fell on soil that wasn't quite ready to let them grow. You look back at the spinning eolipile, a silent testament to a future. That almost was. The golden afternoon of the library cannot last forever. Every great power, every golden age, eventually faces the slow creep of twilight. You feel a shift in the atmosphere of the Musang. The vibrant, collaborative energy begins to curdle into something more cautious, more suspicious. The engine of this decline isn't an external enemy, but a rot from within, the Ptolemaic dynasty itself. The early Ptolemies Soter, Philadelphus, Euergetes were capable rulers who saw the value in their intellectual project. Their successors, however, were a different story. The dynasty degenerated into a tangled mess of sibling rivalry, murder, and bitter civil war. The palace, once a center of enlightened patronage, became a snake pit of paranoia and ambition. And this political instability inevitably spilled into the serene courtyards of the MUSA, UMDA. You are now in the reign of Ptolemy VIII Euergetes II, a man so famously bloated and cruel that he was given the derisive nickname Physcon, or Potbelly. He came to the throne in the mid-2nd century BCE after a vicious power struggle with his brother. Physcon was deeply suspicious of the intellectual elite of Alexandria, whom he believed had sided with his rivals. He saw the independent-minded scholars of the Musang not as an asset, but as a potential threat. And so he initiated a brutal purge. A common fact of this period is that Ptolemy VIII, Physcon, expelled nearly all of the foreign scholars from Alexandria. He drove out the grammarians, the philosophers, the mathematicians, and the physicians who had flocked to the city from all over the Greek-speaking world. It was a catastrophic brain drain. The men who had made the Musang the vibrant center of the world were scattered to the winds, taking their knowledge and talents with them. They founded new schools in places like Rhodes and Pergamum, creating rival centers of learning that diluted Alexandria's unique prestige. The expulsion had a chilling effect on those who remained. The freewheeling spirit of inquiry was replaced by a culture of fear. Scholars became hesitant to tackle controversial subjects or to challenge established orthodoxies, lest they draw the unwelcome attention of the paranoid king. The focus of the scholarship itself began to change. The grand, boundary-pushing scientific work of figures like Eratosthenes and Aristophanes gave way to safer, more pedantic pursuits. Scholarship turned inward, focusing on minute points of literary criticism, compiling dictionaries, and writing commentaries on the commentaries of earlier scholars. It became less about discovering new worlds, and more about endlessly rehashing the old ones. The intellectual fire was dampened, replaced by the dull embers of scholasticism. You can feel the change in the dining hall. The lively debates are gone, replaced by hushed conversations and guarded glances. The joy of discovery has been supplanted by the anxiety of survival. A strange and obscure tale from this period highlights the king's vindictive nature. Among the scholars that Ptolemy VIII expelled was Aristarchus of Samothrace, the esteemed head librarian who had succeeded Eratosthenes. But the king's cruelty didn't stop there. As a replacement, he appointed a man named Sidus, whose primary qualification was not his intellect, but his former role as one of the king's guards. He was a military man, a palace crony, put in charge of the world's greatest repository of knowledge. It's like appointing a drill sergeant to run the National Archives. It was a calculated insult to the scholarly community, and a clear signal that the Musang was no longer an independent institution, but merely another arm of the royal court, subject to the whims of its unstable master. The idea of a soldier guarding the books, rather than a scholar curating them, is a potent symbol of the shift from intellectual exploration to mere preservation, and perhaps even control. The long-term consequences of this period were profound. Historians still debate whether the library ever truly recovered from Physkon's purge. Did the Golden Age end definitively in the 2nd century BCE, long before any fire or battle? It's a compelling argument. While the library and Musam continued to exist and function for centuries, they arguably never regained that initial explosive burst of creative and scientific genius. The foundation had been cracked. The patronage was no longer stable, the intellectual freedom was compromised, and the reputation of Alexandria as a welcoming haven for thinkers was shattered. The institution became more of a legacy to be maintained than a frontier to be pushed. You walk through the now quieter gardens. A statue of a philosopher seems to look down with a sorrowful expression. The change is subtle but pervasive. It's the difference between a thriving living organism and a beautiful, perfectly preserved specimen. The body is still there, but the spirit has begun to fade. The first real threat to the library wasn't fire or war, but a fat, cruel king who feared ideas more than he valued them. The slow decline continues, but the library is about to face its first great, dramatic test, the event that everyone mistakenly thinks of as the end. The year is 48 BCE. The political landscape has shifted dramatically. The Ptolemaic kingdom is a shadow of its former self, a client state teetering on the edge of the ever-expanding Roman Republic. And into this volatile situation sails one of the most famous men in history, Gaius Julius Caesar. You find yourself back on the chaotic docks of Alexandria, but the mood is different now. It's not the bustling confidence of a global hub. It's the tense, nervous energy of a city caught in the crossfire of a superpower's civil war. Caesar has arrived in pursuit of his rival, Pompey the Great, only to be presented with Pompey's head as a gruesome gift from the young king Ptolemy XIII, who hoped to curry favor with the Roman general. Caesar, however, is not pleased. He is disgusted by the murder of a Roman consul and decides to intervene in the ongoing power struggle between the 13-year-old king and his ambitious, brilliant older sister, the 21-year-old Cleopatra VII. Caesar sets up his headquarters in the royal palace, the very same complex that houses the Musam and the Great Library. You are right there, a silent witness to a pivotal moment in world history. Caesar, a scholar and writer himself, must have been in awe of the place. He was now staying just a short walk from the repository of all the world's knowledge. But he had little time for sightseeing. He was dramatically outnumbered, blockaded in the palace quarter by the royal army loyal to Ptolemy XIII. The situation was desperate. From the high windows of the palace, you can see the Egyptian fleet controlling the harbor, cutting off Caesar's escape route and preventing Roman reinforcements from landing. To break the blockade, Caesar makes a fateful decision. He orders his men to set fire to the Egyptian ships in the harbor. It's a bold and ruthless military tactic, classic Caesar, but it has unintended consequences. The fire is a raging success. The wooden ships of the Ptolemaic fleet, their sails and rigging coated in flammable pitch, go up in a spectacular, terrifying inferno. The blaze illuminates the night sky, casting a hellish orange glow over the city. But the strong winds whipping in from the Mediterranean that day carry the flames beyond the harbor. Sparks and burning debris rain down on the city. The fire leaps from the ships to the docks, then to the warehouses and buildings along the waterfront. Panic erupts in the streets. The carefully planned city of Alexandria becomes a scene of chaos. And this is where the historical controversy begins. A common fact, reported by several Roman writers like Seneca and Plutarch, is that this fire spread and destroyed the Great Library. For centuries, this was the accepted story. Caesar, in his bid for survival, accidentally torched the world's greatest treasure. It's a dramatic, tragic narrative with a famous culprit, However, the historical evidence is frustratingly murky. No contemporary account, not even Caesar's own detailed writings about the Alexandrian War, mentions the destruction of the library. It's a curious omission. If he had accidentally been responsible for such a cultural catastrophe, wouldn't his political enemies in Rome have used it against him? This has led many modern historians to be skeptical. They suggest that what likely burned was not the great library itself, which was set back a bit from the docks within the palace complex, but rather warehouses near the docks that contained scrolls. These might have been scrolls awaiting export, or copies being stored before being added to the collection, or perhaps even the confiscated books from the ships. This is the obscure, less dramatic possibility that a significant number of scrolls, perhaps tens of thousands, were lost. But the main institution itself survived. An ancient geographer named Strabo, who visited Alexandria some 20 years after Caesar's fire, describes the Museum as if it is still a functioning institution with a library attached. He mentions that he was shown around by a scholar, which suggests the place was far from a smoldering ruin. So what really happened? Historians still debate the extent of the damage from Caesar's fire of 48 BCE. Was it a devastating blow that destroyed the core collection? Or was it a significant but not fatal incident, more of a flesh wound than a decapitation? The truth is, we will likely never know for certain. The ambiguity itself is part of the library's legend. You stand there, watching the flames lick the sky, smelling the acrid smoke of burning wood, and perhaps burning papyrus. The cries of the city are a symphony of fear. Whether the great building itself is on fire or not is almost secondary to the symbolic horror of the moment. The knowledge, so carefully collected and protected for over 2 centuries, is now threatened. Not by a paranoid king, but by the casual, collateral damage of Roman ambition. It's a powerful and terrible lesson. A library's greatest enemy is often not a specific person who hates books, but the simple, chaotic indifference of human conflict. The flames eventually die down as the sun rises, leaving a pall of smoke over the city. The library, whether scarred or merely singed, has survived its first baptism by fire. But it is a changed place, in a changed world, now firmly under the shadow of Rome. The smoke from Caesar's fire has cleared, both literally and politically. Cleopatra, with Caesar's help, has won the throne. Alexandria is now, for all intents and purposes, a Roman protectorate. The question is, what has become of its most famous institution? You walk once more through the gates of the Museum, half expecting to see rubble and charred beams. Instead, the complex appears largely intact. It may have been singed around the edges, and the collection is likely diminished from the fire in the harbor warehouses. But the heart of the library still beats. Life under Roman influence, however, is different. The boundless wealth that the early Ptolemies lavished on the Museum has dwindled. The new rulers in Rome have their own priorities, and while they respect Greek culture, they don't share the Ptolemaic obsession with funding a single massive intellectual project in a foreign city. The library continues to function, but it's a more subdued version of its former self. It's no longer the undisputed, unparalleled center of the world. Other great libraries, like the one at Pergamum in modern-day Turkey, have risen to prominence, partly thanks to the scholars that Potbelly Feisken expelled. Into this new era steps Cleopatra. She is more than just a femme fatale of popular imagination. She was a brilliant, highly educated woman, the only member of the Ptolemaic dynasty to bother learning the Egyptian language. She was a patron of the arts and sciences, and it's clear she understood the symbolic and practical importance of the library. A common historical narrative, promoted by writers like Plutarch, involves her famous lover, Mark Antony. According to the story, in an attempt to win her favor and to make up for the losses from Caesar's fire, Antony gifted her the entire collection of the Library of Pergamum, some 200,000 scrolls. It's a grand romantic gesture, the second greatest library in the world, given as a lover's gift to replenish the first. This would have been a massive restocking effort, instantly restoring Alexandria's collection to its former glory. It's a beautiful story, a testament to love and literature. However, like so many stories about the library, this one is shrouded in doubt. Historians still debate whether Antony's gift of the Pergamum library ever actually happened. The story is told primarily by Roman writers who were hostile to Mark Antony. They used the tale as propaganda, portraying him as a foolish, besotted man who was giving away Roman provincial treasures to his Egyptian queen. It was meant to show him as un-Roman, squandering the spoils of conquest on a foreign mistress. There is no Egyptian or Alexandrian source that confirms the transfer. Was it a real event, or was it a piece of political slander? A fake news story from the ancient world designed to discredit a political rival? The lack of corroborating evidence makes many scholars suspicious. It might just be a romantic fiction. Still, you can imagine the librarians of Alexandria, if it did happen, facing the logistical challenge of integrating 200,000 new scrolls into their collection. It would have been a monumental task of cataloging and shelving, a welcome problem to have after a period of decline. Whether the Pergamum gift was real or not, it's clear the library continued to be a prestigious center for scholarship well into the Roman era. You see scholars at work, but they are different now. There are more Roman names among them. The focus continues to shift from groundbreaking science to literature, rhetoric, and philosophy subjects more aligned with the Roman educational system. An obscure but telling detail from this period is the changing role of the head librarian. Under the Ptolemies, the head librarian was a top-tier scholar, a giant like Eratosthenes or Aristarchus. Under Roman rule, the directorship of the Museum and library was often a political appointment, given by the emperor to a trusted administrator or even a retired military officer as a kind of prestigious pension. The job became less about intellectual leadership and more about managing an imperial asset. Remember Ptolemy VIII's appointment of a palace guard? The Romans essentially formalized this, turning the head of the world's greatest intellectual institution into just another bureaucratic post. The library settled into a new role. It was no longer a blazing sun of innovation, but a venerable, respected moon, reflecting the glories of the past. It was a place for Roman governors to visit. On a tour, a place for wealthy young Romans to come and finish their education, a kind of ancient Ivy League study abroad program. It was a repository, a museum in the more modern sense, a place that held the canon of Greek thought, which the Romans deeply admired and sought to emulate. The scrolls on the shelves were still there, still being read and copied, but the restless, creative energy was gone. It was like visiting a famous old university that is still beautiful and prestigious, but whose glory days of revolutionary discoveries are now in the past. It's living off its endowment of knowledge. You look at the shelves, perhaps now filled with scrolls from Pergamum, perhaps not. The collection is still vast, the building still magnificent, but the institution has lost its unique purpose. It is no longer driving the future of thought. It is curating the past for a new empire. Centuries begin to blur. The Pax Romana, the long peace that allowed the library to quietly persist, gives way to a period of crisis and instability for the Roman Empire. The world is changing once again. You feel the slow grinding passage of time. The once gleaming marble of the Museum is now weathered and stained. The gardens are not as meticulously kept as they once were. The whole complex has an air of genteel shabbiness, like an old country manor whose family has fallen on hard times. The primary cause of this decline is simple and mundane: money. The unending civil wars, barbarian invasions, and economic crisis. Of the 3rd century CE meant, the Roman emperors had far more pressing concerns than funding a library in Egypt. The generous stipends for scholars dried up. The budget for acquiring new scrolls and maintaining the old ones was slashed. The institution was no longer a priority. You walk through the halls of the great library, and it's heartbreakingly quiet. There are far fewer scholars now. The remaining few are old men, poring over texts with a quiet, desperate intensity, as if they know they are the last of their kind. The scriptorium, once a bustling factory of scribes, now has only a handful of copyists, working with materials that are visibly poorer in quality. The papyrus is coarser, the ink less black. The process of decay is setting in. Papyrus is an organic material. In the dry climate of the Egyptian desert, it can survive for millennia. But in the humid, coastal air of Alexandria, it is vulnerable. Without constant care, recopying, and climate-controlled storage, as much as was possible in the ancient world, scrolls become brittle, susceptible to moisture, mold, and insects. Remember the cedar oil used as a repellent? Perhaps the supply has run low. You can imagine a librarian discovering a priceless text, a unique copy of a lost play by Sophocles, only to find it has crumbled into dust and fragments. This was not a single dramatic destruction, but a slow, creeping death by 1,000 cuts. A death of neglect. A common historical narrative points to a specific military event in the 3rd century as another major blow. In 272 CE, the Roman Emperor Aurelian was fighting to reclaim Alexandria from the breakaway Palmyrene Empire led by the famous Queen Zenobia. The fighting was fierce and took place largely in the Bruchion, the royal quarter, the very neighborhood of the Museum and Great Library. The 4th century historian Ammianus Marcellinus wrote that during this conflict, the entire district was razed to the ground. He describes the walls being torn down and the neighborhood being utterly destroyed. If his account is accurate, this would have been a devastating, if not final, blow to the Great Library. It's hard to imagine the building and its contents surviving a battle that leveled the entire district around it. This event is a strong candidate for the end of the original great institution. However, even this is not a closed case. There's an obscure but important counter-argument. While the great library in the Bruchion was likely destroyed or abandoned after Aurelian's siege, scholarship in Alexandria did not cease. The daughter library at the Serapeum was in a different part of the city and would have been untouched by this conflict. It seems likely that the Serapeum, with its own significant collection, became the new center of intellectual life in the city. The surviving scholars and whatever texts could be salvaged from the wreckage of the Bruchion may have relocated there. So, the Library of Alexandria, as a concept, as a living tradition of scholarship, likely continued, just in a different building. Historians still debate the fate of the Museum's scholarly community. After 272 CE, did it completely dissolve? Or did it migrate to the Serapeum, creating a smaller but still vibrant intellectual hub? The evidence is sparse, but the idea of a government in exile for the library is a compelling one. The world's intellectual focus was also shifting. The rise of Christianity brought with it a new worldview, with new texts and new priorities. The pagan philosophy and science of the classical Greek tradition were increasingly viewed with suspicion, or as secondary in importance to theological questions. The energy and brightest minds of the age were now drawn to debates about the nature of the Trinity, not the circumference of the earth. You can feel this shift in the very air of the city. Alexandria became a hotbed of Christian theology, home to influential thinkers like Clement and Origen. Their scholarship was profound, but it was of a different kind. The universal, secular quest for knowledge that had defined the original Museum was being replaced by a more faith-based system of learning. This wasn't necessarily a dark age, as it's sometimes portrayed, but a fundamental reorientation of intellectual priorities. The library, a symbol of the old pagan world, was becoming a relic, its purpose and prestige slowly eroding in the face of this powerful new tide. It was dying not just from a lack of funds, but from a growing sense of irrelevance. The slow decay of the great library and the migration of scholarship to the full Serapeum has set the stage for the next great cataclysm. The year is 391 CE. The Roman Empire is now officially a Christian empire. The old pagan gods are no longer just out of fashion. They are deemed demonic, and their worship is being actively suppressed. Alexandria is a city on a knife's edge, a tinderbox of religious tension between the large and increasingly militant Christian population and the remaining pagans, who are often intellectuals, philosophers, and the traditional elite. You are standing in the Rhocotis district, looking up at the magnificent Serapeum, which has now been the main center of Alexandrian learning for over a century. It's not just a temple. It's the last major stronghold of pagan culture and intellect in the city, and it is about to become a battleground. The conflict is ignited by the city's powerful and aggressive Christian patriarch, a man named Theophilus. Theophilus was a formidable political operator, determined to assert the dominance of the church over all aspects of life in Alexandria. He discovered a hidden, abandoned temple of Mithras, and in a deliberately provocative act, paraded its pagan artifacts through the streets to mock them. This enraged the pagan community. A group of them, led by a philosopher named Olympius, retaliated by attacking the Christians. They then retreated and fortified themselves inside the massive temple complex of the Serapeum, using it as a fortress. From there, they launched raids, capturing Christians, torturing them, and even forcibly converting them in the pagan sanctuaries. The situation escalated into a full-blown urban conflict. The Roman Emperor, Theodosius I, a devout Christian who had enacted many anti-pagan laws, was forced to intervene. He sent a decree to Alexandria. A common historical fact is that the emperor's decree was a mixed message. He pardoned the pagan rioters for their crimes to avoid further bloodshed, but he also authorized Theophilus to destroy the temple itself, as it had been polluted by the violence. It was a green light for the destruction of one of the wonders of the ancient world. Theophilus read the emperor's letter to a massive Christian crowd gathered outside the Serapeum. The moment the pagan offenders heard they were pardoned, their resolve broke. They fled the temple, abandoning it to its fate. What happened next was a well-documented act of cultural vandalism. A triumphant Theophilus led the Christian mob up the 100 steps and into the sacred precinct. They were on a mission from God to tear down this symbol of idolatry. Not an obscure but vivid detail of the destruction was recorded by the historian Rufinus. He describes a moment of hesitation. The crowd stood before the colossal, magnificent cult statue of Serapis, the one that was rumored to be animated by clever tricks. Remember the sunbeam on the lips? An old superstition held that if anyone were to touch the statue, the sky would fall and the world would end. For a moment, no one dared to move. Then, a soldier, more afraid of Theophilus than of the old gods, grabbed an axe, took a deep breath, and smashed it into the statue's jaw. The crowd gasped. The sky did not fall. The world did not end. The spell was broken. The soldier then chopped off the statue's head, and the mob surged forward in a frenzy. They tied ropes to the remains of the great idol and dragged its pieces through the city to be burned. They then went to work on the temple itself, smashing every statue, effacing every inscription, and systematically demolishing the buildings. And what of the daughter library, the collection of scrolls housed within the Serapeum's porticos? This is where the narrative gets tricky. Historians still debate whether the library was still fully stocked and functioning in 391 CE, and what exactly happened to the scrolls. Some contemporary accounts of the temple's destruction don't even mention a library, which is strange if it were still a major institution. This has led some scholars to believe that the collection may have already been depleted or moved long before this event due to the centuries of neglect and lack of funding. However, the most likely scenario is that any scrolls remaining in the Serapeum were either destroyed in the chaos or looted and dispersed. The Christian historian Socrates Scholasticus, writing a generation later, says the temple was torn down and the pagan images were melted down into pots and other convenient utensils for the use of the Alexandrian church. It's a grimly practical end for sacred art. It is very likely that the papyrus scrolls, symbols of pagan learning, suffered a similar, or worse, fate. They may have been burned as fuel, or simply torn apart by a mob that saw them not as knowledge, but as heresy. The destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE is the most well-documented and certain of all the destruction events. It was a clear, unambiguous act, and it represents the violent end of the public, pagan intellectual tradition in Alexandria. The final story of the library's destruction is the most famous, the most dramatic, and almost certainly a complete fabrication. But its persistence tells us a lot about how we want to remember the library not as a victim of slow decay, but as a martyr to ignorance. You are now leaping forward in time again to the year 642 CE. The world has changed utterly. The Roman Empire in the West has fallen. The Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, Empire is locked in a struggle with a new, dynamic power that has erupted out of the Arabian Peninsula, the Rashidun Caliphate. The Arab general, Amr ibn al-As, has just conquered Egypt for the Caliph, and his army stands at the gates of a much diminished Alexandria. The city, after centuries of religious strife and political decline, surrenders with little resistance. You find yourself in the tent of the conquering general. Amr is portrayed in many sources as a sophisticated and curious man, not a mindless destroyer. He is said to have been impressed by the city's remaining scholars and to have enjoyed their company. One of these scholars, a Christian philosopher named John Philoponus, supposedly strikes up a friendship with the general. According to the legend, Philoponus asks Amr for a favor. He says, "You have seized the whole city and have taken stock of all its treasures. There are some things you may have no use for, which we would value greatly. I mean the books of wisdom that are in the royal treasuries." He is asking, essentially, if he can have the contents of whatever remains of the ancient library. Amr is intrigued, but tells Philoponus that he cannot make such a decision without consulting his superior, the Caliph Omar in Medina. So he writes a letter to the Caliph, explaining the situation and asking for instructions. The reply from Caliph Omar is, according to the story, swift and decisive. It contains the most famous and chilling line in the entire saga of the libraries. Demise. This is the common historical fact, or rather, the common historical myth that has been repeated for centuries. The Caliph supposedly wrote back, "Regarding the books you mention, if what is written in them agrees with the book of God, the Quran, they are not required, for the book of God is sufficient. If what is written in them disagrees with the book of God, they are not desired. Destroy them, therefore." It is the ultimate expression of dogmatic, book-burning intolerance. An entire world of knowledge weighed against a single holy book and found either redundant or heretical. It's a powerful, devastating verdict. The story continues with an equally vivid, if heartbreaking, detail. Upon receiving the Caliph's order, Amr supposedly had the vast collection of scrolls distributed among the 4,000 bathhouses of Alexandria. The papyrus, the story goes, was used as fuel to heat the water for the baths. The number of scrolls was said to be so immense that it took 6 full months to burn them all. It's an image of almost unimaginable cultural desecration. The poetry of Sappho, the histories of Berossus, the scientific treatises of Archimedes, all going up in smoke, their knowledge reduced to the fleeting warmth of a public bath. It's the perfect tragic ending, a final definitive act of destruction, carried out by a single, unambiguous villain. The problem is, almost none of it is true. Historians today almost universally agree that this story is a myth. So why is it so persistent? Let's look at the evidence. The first appearance of this tale comes not in the 7th century, but a full 500 years later, in the 12th century, from a writer named Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi. It was then elaborated upon by other writers in the 13th century, like the Christian Bishop Bar-Hebraeus, who seemed to want to paint the Muslim conquerors in a bad light. No contemporary account of the Arab conquest, not from Muslim, Christian, or Jewish sources, mentions the destruction of any library. An obscure but critical point is that John Philoponus, the scholar who supposedly asked for the books, was likely dead long before the Arab conquest even happened. The timeline simply doesn't work. Furthermore, the idea of using papyrus scrolls to heat bathhouses is logistically absurd. Papyrus burns quickly and produces a great deal of acrid smoke. It would be a terrible source of fuel for heating water. It's a literary flourish, not a practical reality. So, why was the story invented? Historians still debate the exact motives. It might have been a piece of anti-Muslim propaganda created centuries later during the time of the Crusades. Or, as some have suggested, it might have even been a story told by Muslims themselves, perhaps by someone like Saladin in the 12th century, to discredit a rival dynasty that had previously ruled Egypt. Whatever its origin, the myth served a purpose. It provided a simple, satisfying answer to a complex question. What happened to the Library of Alexandria? Instead of the messy, unsatisfying reality of gradual decline, political purges, budget cuts, fires, riots, and changing intellectual fashions, the myth gives us a single, dramatic event and a clear villain. It's easier to blame Caliph Omar than it is to blame 700 years of historical entropy. The story of the bathhouses is not history, but a ghost story, a cautionary tale about the clash between fanaticism and learning. The real tragedy is that by 642 CE, there was likely no great library left to burn. The shelves were already empty. The ashes of the bathhouse fires, real or imagined, have long since gone cold. The great institution is gone. Its memory now belongs to the realm of legend. You are now adrift in time, a silent observer looking back at the ghost of a place. What was truly lost when the scrolls of Alexandria vanished? This is the question that has haunted scholars, poets, and dreamers for centuries. It's a loss so profound it's almost impossible to quantify. We are left with a vast, aching silence in our historical record, a void filled with speculation and regret. We know what survived, but we can only guess at what didn't. You drift through the spectral ruins of the library, the empty shelves stretching into the darkness, and you begin to take stock of the phantom knowledge that haunts these halls. First, there is the literature. We know that the library held the complete works of the great Greek tragedians. A common and heartbreaking fact is that of the roughly 90 plays written by Aeschylus, we have only 7. Of the 120-plus plays by Sophocles, the author of Oedipus Rex, we also have only 7. Euripides fared slightly better, with 19 surviving out of about 92. What happened to the rest? What masterpieces of drama, what profound insights into the human condition were contained in the hundreds of lost plays? We have titles and fragments, tantalizing clues that hint at the treasures we'll never know. We have a few lines from Sophocles. Play Thyestes at Sicyon, but will never read the whole thing. It's like having the corner of a lost painting by Leonardo, or a single perfect chord from a forgotten symphony by Mozart. The loss is immeasurable. The same is true for lyric poetry. We have a handful of complete poems by Sappho, but we know she wrote 9 full volumes of work, all of which were likely held in the library. Her voice, one of the most passionate and personal in the ancient world, now reaches us only in faint, heartbreaking echoes. Then there is the history. The library was a repository of historical texts from across the ancient world. The Babylonians had a priest named Berossus, who wrote a complete history of his civilization in Greek. The Egyptians had a priest named Manetho, who did the same for Egypt. Both of their works were stored in the library. Today, they survive only in fragmented quotations and summaries in the works of later authors. We have their chapter headings, but not the chapters themselves. Imagine having a detailed multi-volume history of ancient Egypt, written from an Egyptian perspective, or a complete history of Mesopotamia from a Babylonian viewpoint. Our understanding of these foundational civilizations would be infinitely richer. One of the most fascinating lost works is the Indica by Megasthenes, a Greek ambassador who lived in India in the 3rd century BCE. He wrote a detailed account of the Mauryan Empire, its culture, philosophy, and geography. It was the West's primary source of information about India for centuries, and it was almost certainly in the library. Today, it exists only in fragments. We lost a window into another world. Perhaps the most agonizing losses, however, are in the fields of science and technology. We know that Archimedes, the greatest mathematician of antiquity, spent time in Alexandria and corresponded with scholars there. Many of his treatises were likely stored on these shelves. While some of his major works survived, others are lost, including, perhaps, more detailed explanations of his inventions, like the famous Archimedes' screw, or his work on levers and pulleys. Remember Hero of Alexandria and his steam engine, the Aeolipile? His writings described numerous other inventions. How many other temple wonders that hinted at modern technology were lost forever? An obscure but tantalizing loss is the work of Ctesibius of Alexandria, a 3rd century BCE inventor and mathematician who was the head of the Muson. He was a pioneer in the study of pneumatics and hydraulics. He is credited with inventing a sophisticated water clock, the clepsydra, that was far more accurate than any before it, and a water organ, the hydraulis. His original writings are completely gone. We know of his genius only through the descriptions of others. Historians still debate the ultimate what-if question. If the library and its knowledge had survived, could it have kick-started the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment more than 1,000 years early? It's a seductive but probably overly simplistic idea. As we saw, the lack of economic incentive for labor-saving devices and a different cultural mindset towards technology were powerful brakes on an ancient industrial revolution. The knowledge on the scrolls alone might not have been enough to overcome those hurdles. And yet, you can't help but wonder, what if Eratosthenes' accurate measurement of the Earth had remained common knowledge, preventing the errors that plagued Columbus? What if Hero's steam engine had been developed not as a toy, but as an engine of industry? What if the anatomical knowledge of Arphilus had continued to be built upon, leading to medical breakthroughs centuries earlier? We can't know. The loss of the library is not just a loss of facts and data. It's a loss of potential, a theft of futures that might have been. You feel the profound weight of this absence. It's the intellectual equivalent of a phantom limb. We can feel the shape of what's missing, even though we can never touch it again. The ghosts of the lost scrolls fade, and you find yourself standing once more on the shores of modern Alexandria. The ancient city is buried beneath the new, a layered memory of stone and dust. For centuries, the exact location of the great library was a mystery, a source of endless speculation for archaeologists and classicists. But the idea of it, the spirit of that grand institution, never truly died. It endured as a powerful symbol of universal knowledge and intellectual freedom. It became a dream, a benchmark against which all other libraries were measured. And sometimes, a dream is so powerful that people try to build it again. You turn your gaze from the Mediterranean Sea towards the city, and you see it, rising from the waterfront, not far from where the ancient library is thought to have stood, is a stunning, magnificent new building. It is the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, the new Library of Alexandria. Inaugurated in 2002, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina is a masterpiece of modern architecture and a conscious resurrection of an ancient ideal. Its main structure is a vast, circular building, a tilted disk that appears to rise from the earth, evoking the image of a second sun of knowledge dawning over the Mediterranean. The outer wall is a sweeping curve of gray Aswan granite, the same stone used in ancient pharaonic monuments. And carved into this wall are characters and letters from every known alphabet in the world, a visual representation of the original library's mission to gather all human knowledge from all cultures. It is a bold, beautiful statement, a message to the world that the dream of Alexandria is alive once more. The project was a massive international effort, supported by UNESCO and countries from all over the globe. It was a recognition that the loss of the original library was a loss for all of humanity, and that its rebirth should be a shared triumph. You step inside, and the scale of the main reading hall is breathtaking. It is a vast, terraced space that cascades downwards over 7 levels, all under the immense, sloping roof that floods the hall with natural light. It can accommodate thousands of readers at once. The space is open, airy, and modern, yet it evokes the same sense of awe and reverence as the ancient library must have. Instead of papyrus scrolls and pigeonholes, there are millions of books on shelves, and rows of computer terminals providing access to the digital universe. The new library is not just a collection of books. Like its ancient predecessor, it is a full cultural complex. It includes 4 museums, a planetarium, art galleries, a conference center, and research facilities. It is once again a place for scholarship, for debate, for discovery. It is the Muson reborn for the 21st century. Of course, a common fact is that the new library can never truly replace the old. The unique, irreplaceable texts of the ancient world are gone forever. We cannot resurrect the lost plays of Sophocles or the scientific works of Casibius. The new Bibliotheca Alexandrina is a great modern library, but it doesn't hold the keys to a lost civilization. So, what is its purpose? Historians and cultural critics still debate the role and impact of this new institution. Is it merely a beautiful monument, a nostalgic gesture to the past? Or can it truly become a new beacon of learning and cross-cultural dialogue in a region often fraught with conflict and misunderstanding? Its mission is to be a center for tolerance, dialogue, and the free exchange of ideas, the very principles upon which the original library was founded. It aims to be a window for the world to look into Egypt and the Middle East, and a window for the region to look out at the world. One of the most poignant and obscure details of the new library is a small, quiet memorial, in the basement, preserved. Behind glass are some of the archaeological remains discovered during the new building's construction. They are not, as some had hoped, the definitive foundations of the great library itself. They are fragments of Roman and Byzantine mosaics, remnants of the later city that was built on top of the Ptolemaic one. It's a quiet, humble reminder of the layers of history on this spot, a tangible link to the past that the new library honors. It acknowledges that it is built not on the actual ruins of the great library, but on its memory, on its powerful and enduring legacy. You stand in this magnificent new space, hearing the quiet hum of servers and the soft rustle of turning pages. It is not the same place you visited at the beginning of our journey. The world has changed. Knowledge is no longer contained in fragile scrolls, but in the ephemeral bits and bytes of the digital age. Yet, the fundamental human impulse that drove Ptolemy I to begin his great collection remains the same. The deep, insatiable hunger to know, to understand, to preserve our stories, and to pass them on to the future. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina is a testament to the resilience of that impulse. It is an act of defiance against the fires, the fanatics, and the simple, slow decay of time. It is a promise, etched in granite and glass, that we will never stop trying to build a place for all the world's knowledge. You feel the journey ending, the sharp details of Alexandria beginning to soften and blur at the edges. The scent of salt and papyrus fades, replaced by the familiar quiet of your own room. The weight of lost knowledge, once so heavy and profound, now feels lighter, transformed from a tragedy into a quiet, enduring lesson. The story of the library is not just about a building that was lost, but about the constant, fragile struggle to create, to preserve, and to connect. The light of that ancient beacon was extinguished, but its memory ignited countless other smaller lights in libraries and universities and minds all across the world, a constellation of curiosity stretching through the centuries. The shelves are empty, yes, but the space they occupied in our collective imagination remains full, a reminder of our highest aspirations. Let the story settle around you now, like dust motes in a sunbeam. Let the quiet rhythm of your own breathing be the only sound. The past is a gentle sea, and you are drifting now safely toward the shore of sleep. The search for knowledge is endless, but for tonight, your part in it is done. It is time to rest, to let the mind be still, to dream of futures that are yet to be written. Sweet dreams.